My name's Dan Newman. I am a consultant with a technical background, and then eventually I went up through project management paths in a lot of traditional software development, and then finally got introduced to Agile in about 2009. And for me, it's been a journey of never going back. I had some opportunities, as they say, about 3 years after I got introduced to Agile. I'm like, I'm not going back. I like the Agile things. It's really exciting for me. And then the question is, what do we do with it? What are the right choices to make as we go along our journey? And so I want to share some of my thoughts with you. I think to the points Joshua was making, there are many paths, and I hope that comes through as I share some thoughts with you folks today. So thank you for taking time to join, and I'm looking forward to spending the rest of the conference with you folks here. I'll take us through a little bit of a roadmap here on Agile methodologies or Agile frameworks that might fit well into your organization. And I thought I'd start with single team activities. Eventually, then we'll talk about multiple teams and scaling at the enterprise. It's really important to start, like we were talking about, Joshua, with the shoe. You start with the small things and then you build on and they build on. I've seen a scaled Agile implementation that started with no Agile to scale, and that didn't go very well. And so I wanted to talk to you about some of the choices I see at the team level and then building up. And then William, I think we'll talk about the journeys as part of his talk, and I'll be looking forward to his thoughts on this as well. I would be surprised if there are too many people on the conference who haven't heard of the Scrum framework. It's certainly the elephant in the room as far as Agile frameworks go. There's a very clear playbook from a shoe standpoint. To do Scrum, you put in the roles, you put in the events, you put in the artifacts. There are training organizations that would love to help you get started. They'll sell you training. They'll give you a certification you can renew every year. It's easy to hire for these roles. You can put out a job description that says, we want a product owner. You can put out a job description that says, we're looking for a Scrum Master. And so it's just really nice and installable. Joshua, I think you were talking about the phrase of immersing. I love the immersive Agile. And one of my concerns when people look at the Scrum framework is sometimes it's more of a submarine in the ocean. They're not really immersed. It's this weird little thing that floats along in the organization that isn't really Agile. They've grabbed Scrum, they've stuck it in, but it's not because it's an organization. It's because somebody saw an article on one of the business magazines about being Agile, and they said, well, if we get ourselves a Scrum team, we're Agile, and so they put it in. Scrum can work really well. I'll show you later, 66% of organizations are doing Scrum. It's often not a wrong choice. It works really well when there's a complex domain with a lot of uncertainty. If you know exactly what you're doing and you do it the same every time, you aren't going to get the benefits from the Scrum framework that come from building an increment, inspecting and adapting, building another increment, inspecting and adapting, and repeating through. The other popular framework I see at the team level is the Kanban method. Sometimes it's called a methodology. I think that's overstepping. Kanban is 6 practices that you can use. Visualize the work, you limit your work in process, you make your policies explicit so everybody knows how to operate in it, and then you kind of watch the system through feedback loops. How are things working? Do we have flow happening? And then you improve that system collaboratively, and you come up with experiments for how to make that system better. And so Kanban and Scrum, for me, are the two that I see most often down at the team level. I like Kanban because it says start where you are and then improve over time. Scrum framework, we talk, there's roles, there's events, there's artifacts. You have to do the Scrum stuff in order to call it Scrum. Kanban's different. It just says start where you are, visualize, limit work in process, make your policies explicit. At the team level, though, Scrum has the majority of the market share at this point. Then you see a little bit of Scrumban, the Scrum with Kanban. You see Scrum and XP. For me, I get a little concerned when I see 2/3 of the companies are just doing Scrum, because it's really hard to deliver an increment every 2 weeks if you're not bringing in extreme programming practices, if you're not looking at DevOps practices, if you don't have the leadership thinking differently about how to do agility, I get awfully concerned when I see Scrum only implementations. But super popular at the team level. What do you do if you have multiple teams? So these two get a little blurry, whether we're just coordinating multiple teams or whether we're doing much scaling. We'll stick our toes in that water. If you're doing Scrum, there are 3 different ways to scale Scrum. And this session isn't about picking apart less versus Nexus versus Scrum at scale. It's just to say, if you're doing Scrum, there are 3 different approaches you can do. Pick one. I don't necessarily think that one is superior over the other one. Maybe you've got somebody in your organization who is experienced with one of these. Maybe you're aligned with Scrum Alliance from a training standpoint, or scrum.org from a certification standpoint. Certainly it makes sense then to look at the scaling framework that's going to fit with your organizing body. Where things get really interesting is methods and approaches when we're talking about the enterprise. It's fairly simple to have Scrum teams, Kanban teams. Maybe your Scrum teams are delivering in increments, your Kanban teams are doing flow. Ultimately, those teams are going to run into impediments within the organization if the organization is really trying to be agile. So what are the options there? Gartner did some research looking at which enterprise frameworks people are using. 2/3 of the organizations are doing at least one agile framework at a scaling entity. And SAFe is certainly in the lead from organizations that have already implemented it. They've implemented and abandoned it. Not a very large percent have abandoned SAFe, or they're considering it. 36% are on the roadmap to go to scaled agile. Right behind that, we've got Scrum of Scrums. Makes sense. Scrum has well over 2/3 of the market from a team standpoint. It makes sense then to look at scaling using Scrum of Scrums. Then Spotify did some interesting stuff a while ago. Spotify was along their agile journey using agile principles, agile values, and they came up with their own approach. They don't just take the Scrum stuff and roll that out. And then they wrote a blog post about it, and other people started saying, hey, wait a minute, what Spotify did was interesting. We should do that too. And it's just been really interesting to see how much traction Spotify model, I'll use quotes, the Spotify model has gotten. Even if you ask Spotify and they go, A, that's not a model, and B, that's not even what we do anymore, because they've moved on. They've taken the agile principles, they've taken the values, and they've moved beyond what is often referred to as the Spotify, model. You've got disciplined agile delivery, coming up behind all those, and large scale Scrum, and then we've got Nexus, which are different flavors of Scrum scaling. Some of these popular frameworks, obviously SAFe has a profound amount of material for it. When we talk, like Joshua was doing, about roadmaps and journeys and shoe things where you can pick up and you can do the practice, SAFe has done a phenomenal job of making materials available. Oftentimes when an organization is saying, well, how can I coordinate multiple teams? How can I look at my portfolio? It's so easy to grab SAFe materials and start introducing people to that. One of the challenges I think SAFe has is just the volume of materials. It used to be called the big picture because it was a massive picture, and there were all the different options that you could drill down into. Even trying to wrap one's head around all the certifications around SAFe can be very challenging. And I wouldn't be the guy to get the test right on what all those certifications are. But I want to give you a little bit of a decision tree, if you will, thinking back to, again, Joshua's given a roadmap. So a little bit tongue in cheek, but bear with me on the decision tree. First of all, do we actually need to coordinate multiple teams? Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. If you don't need to coordinate multiple teams, just use one of the team level frameworks. Use Scrum, use Kanban. It might be sufficient for what you need to do. If you do need coordination of multiple teams, then you need to look at a scaling framework. And I want to be clear, when you might have a lot of teams that can all deliver independently. That's not scaling, at least the way I tend to think about it. It's just having a lot of Scrum teams or a lot of Kanban teams. But when you need those teams to coordinate, I was working with a client who is doing the next generation map of the world. Right? That takes a lot of teams to coordinate satellite data, data from cars, data from terrestrial maps, all kinds of different things. It's a scaling problem. If you're scaling just a product, you can look to scale Scrum, less Nexus, those types of things. Which one do you do? Do you have somebody with experience from a scaling company? Great, use their scaling framework. If not, I don't know, pick a random number, 1 to 3, and pick one of the frameworks. I don't necessarily think that there's the best Scrum scaling framework. Now, if you really want to transform your organization then to be more agile, small, medium, large enterprises, that gets to be a whole different challenge beyond the Scrum framework. If you're small, maybe Scrum scaling still works for you. You want to do the cool thing? Do the Spotify thing. That's what the cool kids are doing these days. I don't know, the digital natives, as they say, or the Gen Y and Z, that's where they're at. If you're a large enterprise, do you want a lot of guidance? Do you need an industry leader? And do you really like paying for certifications? You've got SAFe. If not, maybe you look at Disciplined Agile. One of the things I liked about Disciplined Agile is it said, hey, based on what your needs are for agility, here's a bunch of options. You can pick one and go forward with it. Much less market share. And hopefully I didn't poke anybody in the eye, metaphorically. I definitely don't want to insult somebody with the way this chart's drawn, but hopefully it's a little bit of a helpful framework for making decisions. Now I want to take us to talk a little bit about why organizations need to transform and talk about more of the enterprise side. These are 4 of the reasons we at least see organizations challenged, or where we see them challenged, and then we'll talk about how to address them. Right? Budget and scope. How much does a product cost? We thought it was going to take a year. It took us 2. There's a satellite that's going to get launched, the Hubble replacement. And I saw a news story about that. It was going to cost something like $1 billion, and it's going to cost 10. It was going to be done in a year, and it's going to take 10. It's just scope creep when you're doing really complex things, or budget increase is a major problem. When we're doing complex things, it's really hard to predict where we're going to get. We end up in these poor cultures where there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame going around. We have teams that aren't teams. And then we have a lack of innovation. So these 4 organizational challenges are reasons we see organizations wanting to do something different. They want the agile. I like this little way of thinking. It's a sense-making framework called Cynefin, and we won't go into that here, but it talks about different types of problems, simple problems. I want my fast food hamburger. There's a very specific way to make the fast food hamburger. It's easy, it's repeatable. There's not a lot of decision-making that goes on there. That's not an agile journey. There are complicated ones where my car is doing something weird. I'm not the expert. I need to take my car to the expert and have somebody look at it, diagnose it, and give me the solution. That's also not an agile journey. It's not a matter of simply diagnosing and then making the right decision. What we have with a lot of agile journeys is complexity. We don't know the exact behavior we'll get when we make a change. And so we have to make a change, look for the result, and then make the improvement. And Joshua, you used the plan, do, check, adjust was the example you made that. And that's really awesome for complexity. We've got a plan, right? We don't go in with no plan. We're going to do something, we're going to check the result, and then we're going to adjust from there. And that's a really wonderful way to think about an organization's agile journey. Along these journeys, there's 4 facets I'll introduce you to. The quadrants, the way they're drawn out, so the agile part. Are we building increments and adapting our plan? This is the domain of things like Scrum and Kanban. Delivering the increments really hard. And so that's where we start to look at DevOps. How do we make frequent deliverables fast and reliable? We can't deliver frequently and keep breaking stuff. That's a really good way to break your company and end up out of a job. Then there's the product side. Are we even offering the right products and services to people that we're dealing with? You can have an agile team delivering increments all day, but if it's not a product somebody wants, what's the point? And then the last quadrant over here is about the portfolio. Is the organization focused on the right outcomes that they're trying to get? So it's not simply good enough to have products that are being delivered if they're not aligned with the organization's outcomes. So we'll spend the last part of our time here together on this section before we hand off to William, kind of exploring each of these 4 areas. And this is where I don't feel like there's a specific framework you need to go and get, but I want to introduce you to some concepts so you can look at your own needs and say, oh, here's the challenge we're having. Maybe we go address that challenge with a particular approach. So the Agile part, William was talking about, I'm sorry, Joshua was talking about the teams. You know, are we doing iterative delivery? Have we created small cross-functional teams using the Scrum term who can self-manage, take a product backlog, understand their why, deliver that, and then do continuous reviews and retrospectives to improve what they're doing? This is the team level, and I'm afraid a lot of times agility gets stuck here because then it bumps into organizational challenges. Oh, we've built an increment, but we can't release it to production because there's a heavyweight change management process. Or we've built an increment, but we're really not sure if we've broken something else, and so we aren't safe to release that increment somewhere else. You also get teams that are just doing backlog items. Their backlog is essentially a requirements document. They don't really understand who they're doing it for. They don't understand the pain they're trying to remove for the person. They aren't even sure the real business opportunities they're trying to address. So these are where techniques like user personas come to mind. Who really is the person we're trying to address? Are we trying to address a single mother who's a professional and is raising a family of 3? Or are we trying to address a retiree who's not tech savvy? Understanding whether you're going for, you know, young multitasking professionals or retired older folks is really a big deal as you start thinking about your product. What's the journey that person's going through as they interact with your organization, with your company? What opportunities are there to solve problems for them? And then I like the technique of story mapping, because I've never been in an organization that has had more technology capacity than they've had ideas. And so we have all these ideas and people get frustrated that they can't get all their ideas right away. And that's where story mapping, you start looking at what are the challenges, what are the needs, and then you start exploring how to address those with user stories or backlog items. And then you start drawing lines. This is what the first slice of our product is going to be. These things can wait, etc. And so you really start talking about, are we offering the right products and services to the right people at the right time? So the product piece pairs very well with the Agile piece. But it's no good if you build the thing and you can't deliver it to anybody. And that's where the mindset of DevOps or the practices come in. And I've had some really good discussions. There's sometimes felt like arguments about whether Agile is a subset of DevOps or DevOps is a subset of Agile. I don't care. This is just really like, when you start thinking of DevOps, what are the practices? What are the principles around that? How can we do predictable deployments? There are some great ways of doing that depending on which cloud technology you're using or depending on how you're hosting yourself. But really taking a mindset of how do we predictably deploy, super important. I've seen DevOps teams completely separate from the development teams. For me, I think that's a bit of a misinterpretation of what DevOps is really striving for. The approach I take when I think about it is, do we have the people who are building it also aware of how to operate it, and are they doing things so that it can be operated? It's not, you know, I build it over here and I throw it over the fence to somebody else and then they are responsible for operating. So how do we make sure that we're smoothing out those handoffs or eliminating them when possible? When it breaks, how do we support it? And then when I was talking about teams delivering and being unsure if they broke something, how do we do automated builds? Are they executing the tests? How do we reliably deploy it? I'm sure everybody on here who's been around software has seen something get deployed from dev to test to prod environments, and somebody goes, oh, we forgot to flip the bit, make the configuration, set something in that environment, and it broke. So we need the ability to automatically get builds, execute tests, and do deployments. And just thinking of these three quadrants, then you can't do this all at one time. The organization can't stop and say, okay, what we're going to do for the next quarter is set up Agile teams, improve how we do the product, set up DevOps pieces. And so it's a matter of figuring out where is your pain now, addressing that pain and making adjustments. Yes, have a roadmap, do planning, but it would be really important to make sure that your plan also plans for your plan, do, check, adjust loops that were mentioned in the first session. And then the last chunk I want to introduce you to is on the portfolio side. And this is where enterprise agility really starts to come in. How are we making our decisions at the portfolio level? So we have finite capacity, whether it's people or money or supply chain, whatever you're going to consume as part of your portfolio, it's finite. And so we need to be really focused on what are our portfolio decisions. We've all, I think, been on a highway where there's too many cars and nothing moves. And so that's an example of fixed capacity and unconstrained demand. So at the portfolio level, let's make that demand visible using Kanban approaches. What's your process? Make it visible. Limit work in process, explicit policies so that decisions can get made appropriately at the organization level. It's also fairly common to see organizations that don't know what the value stream looks like. How does their organization produce value for its customers, for the people who are stakeholders in it? And so that may be where using value stream mapping is appropriate to start to bring visibility to how value is created. And then you can also use Kanban method there. Where are the bottlenecks in that value stream? I think it was Goldratt was the author of the book named The Goal, where he talks about value streams from a manufacturing standpoint. And then, of course, there have been other business fables since then, but really talks about how do we deliver value? How do we remove impediments? Objectives and key results got super popular because Google does it. So again, the cool kids do it, so everybody else should too. But with objectives, what is the real objective of an organization, and how do we know if we've achieved it? Objectives are those aspirational ways of describing what we're trying to be. It's the why that was being talked about by Joshua, but it's the why at the organizational level. And then how do we know if we are getting there? We've taken a metric from X to Y. We've improved sales from $10 million to $20 million, or we've decreased attrition from 30% to 20%. It's a very specific measure. And those measures then allow the other parts of the organization below the top to look at the objectives and the key results that matter for the organization and figure out how they then can align with those and come up with objectives and key results to support them. So it's a way for the organization to know where they're going and to support without having micromanagement all the way down. And then the last piece at the organization level I want to talk to you about is called the 3 horizons of innovation. Horizon 1 is, look, we know exactly what we're doing. We know how to do it. Now the challenge becomes, how can we do that as efficiently as possible? How can you drive waste out of that? How can you increase reliability? How can you make it more repeatable? And a lot of times that's not the domain of what I would think of as agile methods, even Scrum teams. That often is more over on the domain of lean or Six Sigma or those types of processes where you're trying to drive out waste. There's not as much uncertainty in Horizon 1 for most organizations. Where you get more uncertainty is in Horizon 2, which is we have a product. Now, where else could we use this product? And I think Uber is a good example of this. Uber's business model, drive people around. Horizon 2 for Uber at one point was, we drive people, why not just drive food? And so they took their people moving business and they made it a food moving business. And that's an example of taking one product and using it somewhere else, Horizon 2. And then Horizon 3 is the crazy stuff where people are like, yeah, let's just go do lean startup types of things. We have a whole new business hypothesis. And that for me is a great place for the Scrum framework and doing things in conditions of high uncertainty where you need to build an increment, inspect, and adapt with your stakeholders. So that is a quick run through of the 4 quadrants there. And I'll leave you with this last thought. There are no 2 transformations that are the same. There's no one journey that everybody should go on. I think that's the reason we see organizations say, well, I want to go do the Spotify thing. Well, that was Spotify's journey. It doesn't necessarily make sense for another organization to try to go on the Spotify journey. And even if it did, Spotify was at a different place when they started than your organization is now. Your goals might not be the same. So that's another reason it might not make sense. And even if you start with a path, it's going to change and you need to do continuous improvement. So that's the real goal, is not to, well, actually, maybe we'll see about this in the panel. I think it was the destination or a stopover. So Joshua and William, maybe we'll talk about it in the panel, but I don't see it as a prescribed path to a destination, but I would advocate the real goal is continuous improvement. So I will encourage you along your journey, and I want to appreciate the chance to explore this with you.